We are here together at UCHRI with Joshua Clover and Michael Szalay, who have this spring co-convened the resident research group on culture, industry, finance. And they're here to talk a bit about the group and what they've been up to. It's a pleasure to have had you here. We've heard good things emanating down the hallways, among other things, laughter, but more serious discussion. And so I'll begin just by asking you what the group is about, what you've been up to, what the range of the discussions have been, and we can take it from there.
I think after 10 weeks, we still haven't figured out what order we speak in and how to negotiate it. So the group is called Culture, Industry, Finance. In formulating the call and the topic, it became important to us not to have any sort of conjunctions or grammar that associated those three things, but just offer them a sort of three polarities that could be sort of gathered into pairs. We wanted to give a certain amount of flexibility to different kinds of projects that could be included in. And I think what was most interesting to me about the way it unfolded was that there was an initial sort of sense of standing back to back, the group facing in a couple different directions, but standing in the same place and working from the same position. So on the one hand, and this has to do, I think, both with our initial formulation of our proposal, all the way through the people who were chosen collectively with the Institute. On the one hand, there were people who were working quite specifically and concretely on the culture industry as such, so on Hollywood or on television. And then there were people who were working on sort of the category of culture and its relationship to financialization or to the nature of finance and industrial production in ways that were more that lacked a classic textual object, but were more sort of based in those theories. And I think this was, as I said, present in our initial proposal. I think it played out over the course of the term, and it presented some puzzles, to be honest. I think we had repeated debates on the status of what it meant to make a reading of something, since some of us clearly were working on text or cultural objects, and some of us less so. But I think it also is what gave the group its dynamism and its capacious sense, that there was a lot of ways to go into different sort of regions of theory that weren't all about theories of how to read something, but were theories of the structure of culture or the structure of finance, the structure of industry, where we were given permission to talk about economic theory and political economy as much as we were given license to talk about the structure of media conglomerates and so on. So that for me was the main experience, was that initial split and the ways that it was generative and the puzzles that it produced for us.
It's beautifully said. I've shared with Joshua the sense that this went very well and want to express my gratitude to you and to the foundation for making it possible.
He's the nice one.
He's the incisive one. You know, we pointedly held off until I think about a week ago, really sitting down and beginning to think through what our shared collaborative project would be after this. And that turned out to be exactly the right thing to do. We've had a series of intensive meetings since then. And it came together relatively quickly, but couldn't have been possible at the start of the 10 weeks because exactly as Joshua said, we really were seen a certain way coming from radically different places, the 8 of us. But, you know, we began with a series of readings, pointedly Giovanni Rigi's The Long 20th Century and then Crisis Theory and Marx, that really did successfully frame a series of conversations over the course of the 10 weeks that were simultaneously, sometimes exclusively theoretical, sometimes they were oriented towards a series of problems in the humanities involving, as Joshua said, what to do with cultural objects, how to read them symptomatically or in some other way. So questions about how to read, for example, were in some sense fluently integrated with the status of the culture industry generally. So the question of culture as an object available in the humanities, or culture as the site of industrial production, took shape for us within a framework that turned out, as I say, to have been really productive. And so whether it was in the case of Eleanor dealing with the libidinal economy in the transition in Paris between the structuralist and post-structuralist moment, or two or three of us writing about the television industry proper, or Joshua gave an amazing paper today about kind of tropological reading of history and comedy in relationship to Marx and to capital. We did finally find a set of terms, I think, through which these seem to be the same conversation. More than that gets kind of maybe too immediately tedious for this session, but we end up coming up with a paradigm loosely organized around crisis theory and a shared understanding that this was a particularly interesting moment involving a hegemon transfer. I mean, so one of the implicit contexts for us was the end of days sense that culture broadly now seems to share, but I think starting with the UCHRI, we were able to specify that much more concretely in terms of how and in what way culture functions within a moment of crisis giving way to hegemonic power rising elsewhere. And those terms, I think, worked even for Eleanor's account of the liberal economy in the 60s and more up-to-minute accounts of, culture of an industrial sort now.
I think, so the first thing I want to reiterate Michael's sense that it went well. It was possibly implicit in what I said before, that there were risks at the beginning. There were these, a split isn't right, but a sense that people were facing in different directions, and there's always a sense that can go poorly, that differences in apparatus can become rifts in how one wants to talk about things, what one wants to talk about. The opposite happened. I think in general we should chalk it up to luck more than to our own skill or perspicacity. I'm grateful for that luck. I will say that in assembling the group, which of course we got to offer input, but the center itself read the applications and participated in the process. It was quite collaborative. In moments when we were unsure in assembling the group, one of the things we chose to do was to try and include people who we thought would be insightful respondents, even if their project was a little more distant from the core of what we saw ourselves doing. And I think that was a wager that worked out extremely well for us, which is, as Michael's noted, it turned out by the end it was clear that our projects were fairly coherent, but at the same time we had people who were extremely engaged. It's a relatively small group of 8. I gather the history of the UCHRI often groups have been somewhat larger, but everyone really contributed substantially, and we had a great time.
We did, and it was, in the spirit of what Joshua just said, it was a well-balanced eclecticism. So when faced with that initial applicant pool, it became clear that we weren't going to turn up, say, 8 people studying the industry in some particularly focused way. We ended up going for a group of people, I guess we together ended up going for a group of people that were kind of spread out enough from each other that there were these moments when maybe 2, 3 in the room had one sense and the other, but it didn't break consistently, so that we had blocks. And because there really weren't any 2 people in the room that were after the same thing or doing the same thing. And so instead we had a set of conversational parameters, and we were able to kind of bounce off each other in ways that I think helped people's individual projects substantially, for me, substantially.
I think one bit of, in some sense, again, not terribly planned, good fortune was the model we were working through. Again, Giovanni Arrighi was an important text for us, but not the only one. But in the model of sort of systemic crisis that asks the question about the ways that it might be either related to a next cycle and what that would look like and where it might arise, and hydraulic relationships among economies, cultures, productive centers around the globe. The model itself asked us to think beyond the Western European, United States, Anglophone world, to think quite seriously about what was happening economically and culturally in East Asia, which Colleen was a major contributor to, and what might be happening in India or in all the BRICS economies as they rise, so like emerging economies in their cultures. We would have loved to have had more expertise in those categories, but the nature of our inquiry, rather than some sort of imposed we need some good demographic breadth to this. I actually sort of believe in that. I'm from that generation or school where I'm like, yeah, you should put together a diverse group. Interestingly, even without having to apply that force, we were pushed to think about those questions by the research question. And I think that was healthy for us.
Yeah. And it ended up being a wide-ranging examination of a whole range of economisms, so that what we ended up doing, I think, is producing comparative accounts of really the quite deep roster of ways that culture has been understood in relationship to something like industry, finance, capitalism. There was no one mode that we ended up propounding collectively, but I think we did a good job of moving through accounts from the social sciences, from the humanities, different modes of explaining particularly how to understand culture in relationship to properly, to political economy. And, you know, that was profoundly useful to me, because you don't often find that comparativist model at work in a particular seminar. You don't often teach that way yourself. And each person in that room had a subtly different account of how they wanted to think about culture and relationship. And industry and finance, in a way, ended up just standing in for us, for capitalism broadly conceived.
And for periodization, right? I mean, the class was like a period dominated by industrial capital and then by finance capital, which seems to name our time. So if crisis is a category of theoretical understanding, it's also a periodizing category. We're thinking, and the volume we're planning on putting together is on what we refer to as the long crisis, which is the period from the so-called signal crisis of the American regime in the late 60s, early 70s, with obviously entangled in and causing numerous global effects, and then the span there, of which a series of inflating bubbles, but no real recovery, to the most recent, of course, global crisis of 2008 and ongoing. So it's both a structural logic, but also a period. I feel like we're talking a lot about what we did well. Let's talk about what did we do badly.
Good question.
Technology, I mean, the relation of, new forms of finance in relation to new modes of the technological and cultural production in those terms.
We spent a week talking about algorithms and the new regulatory regimes they initiate, and how and in what way.
You mean financial algorithms in particular?
Financial algorithms in the formation of everything from the Black-Scholes formula to algorithms understood as a more or less Foucauldian disciplinary measure for organizing and policing new networked forms of sociability.
It's interesting you mentioned that. I'm in discussion with a colleague in Britain, a younger person sort of emerging out of digital studies, on developing something we're calling algorithm studies. The social life of the algorithm and the shaping of contemporary, not just cultural life, but also economic and...
There is this field that I assume that would be adjacent to, which is critical code studies. And of course,
The contrast is to, what is algorithm studies that's not code studies?
No, that's exactly right. And one of the people we accepted was a graduate student who comes out of critical code studies. He's in a cultural studies program, so he clearly qualifies for the humanities, but he's a former coder, and he works pretty aggressively on code and algorithms, and he was great to have, Of course, as an old person, there's a little bit of the fear of the whiz kid, but he was great to have. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, it's an interesting set of questions. Also, this came up in one of the Galloway readings that we assigned, that, how and in what way in a traditional humanistic education, code should be considered a second language in a way that replaces a traditional literary one. It is an emerging field. We were reading, some of our material was Google translated from the French, because it hadn't yet made its way into more established forms.
With all its quirks and
hiccups. And we did read a quick history of kinds of computer language from the 40s to the present, and
Donald Mackenzie.
but also the charts that Evan gave out, that list of charts.
Wendy Chung as well.
Yeah. I mean, I would say in terms of the structure of the seminar, the thing that I thought we did worst was...
Although interestingly, he wasn't eager to have us follow up on that line of questioning.
But it's a very interesting question. One learns most from failure, as the
maybe it's a sign of some anxiety.
as a man of enterprise might say.
Well, no, I'm just, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about this. This is my first time running a thing like this, and I loved it. I could imagine doing it again. I want to do it better. So I'm thinking about ways to make it work. I thought we were not quite persuasive enough about getting people to show incomplete ongoing work early on. And of course, one of the people who have to go the earliest in the cycle, they're probably going to be presenting work that's already been developed the previous quarter or the previous year. There's some inevitability to it. But if I were doing it again, I would try and conceive of some structure that made it a little more possible for everyone to show brand spanking new work. Of course, that involves not just the timing of who presents when, but also shared trust in the room. And,
that's right. We also started with a kind of trial by fire with some of our most challenging readings. And I think precisely as a function of the eclecticism we were describing, a lot of people after those first 2 weeks said, oh man, it turns out that the book I'm writing is not as immediately pertinent to these first 2 weeks of reading as I thought. That said, I think that ended up not being a substantial problem because there was real buy-in to the theoretical conversation, but that did come at the expense of producing a conversation that was immediately useful in more concretely instrumental ways for everyone in the room. So I think there's not a person who won't, in some sense, really wrestle with what we read collectively, and it will change all of their projects, but I don't think it will change it quite as immediately as some might have expected. And this was a function of the fact that, our call, the applicant pool that we got in relationship to our call was orthogonal in some ways to it. And that turned out to be, as we've said, a really great thing, but that it also meant that some people in the room showed up thinking it was going to be a little more concretely focused on the culture industry, for example. Again, as the person co-convening that was most invested in that aspect of it, I'm actually perhaps the one most pleased that it didn't, because I too this has reoriented what I thought was my own relationship to the material, and I'm one of the conveners. So that did make people reluctant initially to just kind of say, here's what I'm doing. There was a kind of caginess as we went along, and people wanted to see where this all went.
I mean, I think, there's a model where you decide you're going to have a residential research group on Flaubert, and everybody is in fact already writing about Flaubert, and it's already happening, and they present their work, and at the end you gather their writings on Flaubert, and there you are. And there's this other model where you work through problems quite seriously, and it transforms what everyone's doing. And I think we're much closer to that.
UCHRI is committed to the latter model.
Well, I'm happy to hear that.
Than the former.
Also,
the spirit of what Joshua said about never having done something like this before, it is such an interesting experience. We've all taught seminars, right? You go into that room, though, knowing that if you simply sit down thinking you're going to teach the other 8 people in the room, that things won't go so well, socially, intellectually, in every way. And so those first couple of weeks are very intense, and they're very fraught because you're negotiating each other socially. You've not met half the people. You're figuring out politically where you each stand intellectually. And I guess, we'd be lying if we said that it wasn't fraught in its way initially. But I do think that the way it was fraught ended up being productive in that it destabilized a lot of the people in the room, me, everyone else. But it worked out well. But it's such a short period of time, the 10 weeks. And so you're starting to hit your stride and really knowing what you're about collectively, and people are starting to leave. I want this group to come together not just once again next year, but as often as we can swing it, because you really start towards the end to understand where everyone's coming from and to know how you can help someone else's project and how they can help yours. And so my overwhelming feeling as it ends is that I hope this isn't the end. I hope we can get endless stream of funds from UCHRI. We do this every year.
We will do our best, whether it's endless is an open question.
Endless sounds.
Turn out to know a great deal about financial instruments now, so we can.
We might call on you.
Future options in our group.
That way danger lies.
Thank you very much. This has been delightful having you here. And
truly, I mean, this has been a really good experience.
it is quite common, if not always, that we hear that the residence group transforms how people think about their own work. I mean, that's a very common phenomenon and something we're enthused about, obviously. I mean, it has an impact on, as you put it, reorienting how one thinks in relation to one's object of analysis.
Yeah, I mean, I ended up producing, so Josh and I went last, and we each did works in progress, and in a way, we might have been the only two that did purely from scratch works in progress, and the piece that I ended up producing, I never could have expected going into it that would have been the one that I would be producing, and that was only a good thing as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah. I mean, for me, and this is the advantage of being the convener, is because we got to set the initial proposition for the reading list, and then we took input and made changes, and some people said, well, in my week, I'd like us to read this, and we went along with that, absolutely. But we did have the initial shaping. What it allowed for me was, my political economy that I'd learned. I've done my best, but it's always a bit catch as catch can, and you're taking a bit and figuring out what you can say about, post-73 poetry, which is hypothetically and this is a chance to be legitimately systematic about it. That's the time that you bought us. Like, let's be honest, the time you bought us allowed a degree of, for me, I can't speak for the rest of the group, a degree of systematicity that I hadn't really had available to me before that's been tremendously useful, and I know now stands as kind of a base for the next couple things I'll do.
Good.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much. Yeah, a pleasure, and
Thank you, everyone.
do come back.